In the spring of 1861, when America's heart was breaking in two, there was a small settlement hidden between the Tennessee ridges, a mist-wrapped valley the locals called Maple Hollow. It wasn't on most maps, and those who stumbled upon it said it felt trapped in a gentler century, where the hills hummed old hymns and the night carried more than just the sound of crickets. At the edge of the town stood a white clapboard church, simple but proud, and beside it the parsonage where preacher Samuel Grant and his wife Eleanor lived. Samuel was known for his sermons, steady as the mountains, humble as rain. But it was Eleanor who drew people in. She had a quietness that made even the most restless heart pause. Her eyes held something ancient, something that made the sick hopeful and the grieving still. Yet, beneath that serenity, there was a whisper about her that folks couldn't explain. They said the preacher's wife had a gift, and maybe something more. The Grants' parsonage was the only home in Maple Hollow where every door was always unlocked. Travelers, soldiers, and beggars passing through the valley could find food, warmth, and a bed. Eleanor would greet them with a candle in hand, her shawl wrapped tight, and a softness in her tone that felt like forgiveness itself. Her kitchen always smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. Samuel would sit with guests by the fire, asking where they'd come from, what they'd seen of the war. But Eleanor rarely asked questions. She just listened until people spoke their own healing into the silence. Yet soon, the townsfolk began to notice something strange. Every traveler who slept under the Grants' roof seemed to leave, changed. Some said they'd seen visions. Others swore they'd felt death come for them, only to wake as if reborn. And so, whispers began to travel through the hollow faster than the wind. The preacher's wife resurrects her guests at midnight. It was a cold, rain-slick evening when a boy collapsed on the church steps, a Confederate drummer no older than 16. His uniform was torn, his face pale as candle wax. Samuel and Eleanor carried him inside, laying him on their parlor cot. The boy burned with fever, murmuring names and battle cries. Samuel prayed aloud, but the boy's breath faltered with every hour. "He's slipping away," Samuel whispered at midnight, exhaustion in his voice. Eleanor knelt beside the boy, her eyes shining with tears. "He is someone's son, Samuel. Let him not die alone." When Samuel finally drifted to sleep, she stayed beside the boy, holding his trembling hand. Then, softly, she began to hum a melody, a tune unlike any hymn from their church. It was older, deeper, the kind of song that sounded like it came from before the world had names for things. As her voice filled the small house, the candle flame flickered higher, its glow wrapping the room in a warm gold light. And just before dawn, the boy's eyes opened. He drew a long, rattling breath. "I saw her," he whispered weakly. "A woman made of light. She told me it wasn't time yet." Samuel woke to find him sitting up, color back in his cheeks. "Who?" he asked. The boy looked at Eleanor. "Her." By the week's end, the drummer boy was strong enough to walk. When he left town, he carried a small loaf of Eleanor's bread and a hymn she'd written on a torn scrap of paper. But the story of his resurrection didn't stay behind. It grew. At the market, women whispered as Eleanor passed, "She sings the dead back to life. She prays with fire," they say. "She's not of this earth." Eleanor never answered the gossip. She still came to church every Sunday, still helped the sick, still smiled her small, patient smile. But sometimes, when she looked toward the mountains, there was a heaviness behind her calm, like she knew something the rest of them didn't. One gray October afternoon, the valley was thick with fog when a knock came at the church door. Samuel opened it to find a man slumped against the post, bleeding from his side, a Union soldier this time, far from home and the wrong color uniform for that part of Tennessee. Samuel hesitated. Harboring an enemy soldier could bring ruin, or worse, from the Confederate patrols nearby. But Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm but tender. "He's not an enemy tonight, Samuel. He's just a soul in need." Samuel sighed, torn between duty and faith, but he nodded. "Then let mercy lead us." They laid the man by the fire, cleaned his wound, and prayed. Yet by nightfall the soldier was near death. His lips were blue, his pulse faint. Eleanor looked at him long, her hand trembling as she reached for the candle beside the bed. When the clock struck 12, the house was still except for the soldier's shallow gasps. Samuel, worn from tending the man all evening, had fallen asleep in his chair. Eleanor rose, lit the candle anew, and began to hum. It was that same haunting melody, the one she had sung for the drummer boy. It filled the room with a low, glowing hum, like the walls themselves were praying. The candle's flame shimmered strangely, rising high, then steady. As Eleanor's voice grew softer, the soldier's breathing deepened. Color returned to his face. His eyelids fluttered, then opened wide. He blinked at her, confused. "Where am I?" "You're safe," she whispered. "You crossed the river but found the shore again." The man's eyes filled with tears. "I saw my mother calling me home. Then I heard a song pulling me back." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That song wasn't mine, child. It was the Lord's mercy answering your mother's prayer." At dawn, Samuel awoke to find the soldier sitting upright, speaking softly with Eleanor. Relief washed over him. But then he saw her hands. The skin was red and blistered, as though she'd held the flame itself. "What happened?" he asked, horrified. Eleanor hid her palms beneath her shawl. "Sometimes healing costs something, Samuel." He wanted to press her further, to demand what she meant, but something in her expression, both pain and peace, silenced him. Outside, a rooster crowed, and a new day broke over Tennessee Hollow, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something far beyond his understanding lived beneath his roof. The story of the Union soldier spread even faster than the first. A miracle in the middle of war. Surely word would travel. But not everyone saw it that way. Farmers muttered by their wagons. Wives clutched their rosaries when Eleanor passed. Even the church pews began to feel colder when she entered. Some said she was raising men who ought to stay dead. Others said she'd made a deal with the devil himself. One night, as Samuel locked the church doors, he overheard two men whisper, "She brings 'em back to life, but they ain't quite right." Seen it in their eyes. Like death still in 'em, the preacher walked home with a heavy heart. At supper he said softly, "They're beginning to fear you, Ellie." Eleanor stirred her soup slowly. "Then let them. Fear will fade, but kindness lasts." The next evening, Sheriff Amos Lark arrived at the parsonage. He was an old friend of Samuel's, a grizzled man with tired eyes and a Bible verse tattooed on his wrist. "Judge not, lest ye be judged." He sat by the fire, hat in hand. "Sam," he said, "you know I'd never bring harm to you or your wife. But the town's restless. They're saying Eleanor's meddling in dark things. If you care for her, tell her to stop before someone else decides she shouldn't be allowed to." Samuel clenched his fists. "She's done nothing but heal the sick. How can mercy be a crime?" The sheriff sighed. "You know how folks are. They don't see miracles. They see threats. And threats get burned before they get understood." From the kitchen doorway, Eleanor appeared, her expression serene. "Let them come if they must," she said softly. "If my prayers are mistaken for magic, then perhaps they need to remember what faith looks like." The sheriff shook his head. "Faith or not, people get scared. And scared people do foolish things. Only a week later, there came frantic knocking in the middle of the night. A young mother stood outside, soaked from the rain, clutching her little boy in her arms. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale as paper. "Please, Miss Eleanor," she cried. "He's all I have left." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Samuel. "If I help again, they'll come for us." Samuel met her eyes, his voice low. "And if you don't, you'll never forgive yourself." She nodded. "Then so be it." They laid the boy by the fire. Eleanor brushed the damp hair from his forehead and began her hymn once more. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger, purer, like the sound of a soul refusing to give up. The mother knelt beside her, sobbing, whispering the Lord's Prayer through shaking lips. The candle flame danced wildly, and then, as the final note left Eleanor's lips, the boy gasped, coughing hard. His eyes flew open. "Mama," he whispered hoarsely. The woman screamed with joy, hugging her son tight. "He's alive! Oh, sweet Lord, he's alive!" But outside, through the window, Eleanor saw a dozen shadows in the fog. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, their lanterns flickering like judgment itself. She knew what would follow. Kindness had saved a life, but it had also sealed her fate. That night the hollow was thick with fog, so dense it swallowed the moonlight. But through it came a glow, faint at first, then growing. Dozens of lanterns and torches, bobbing like fireflies. Voices murmured. The sound of boots scraped against the gravel road. Samuel looked out the window and froze. The townsfolk were gathering outside the parsonage, men with anger on their faces, women clutching their shawls tight. Eleanor stood behind him, calm as ever. "They've come," she said softly, "just as the Lord said they would." He turned to her, desperate. "Eleanor, hide, please. Let me speak to them." She shook her head gently. "No, Samuel. You've spoken enough for me. Tonight, they must hear the truth from my heart." The torches flickered closer. The hollow that once sang with crickets now throbbed with fear. Outside, a voice called out. It was Sheriff Amos Lark. "Reverend, bring your wife out. No harm will come to her if she tells us what she's been doing." Samuel looked to Eleanor, but she simply took his hand and whispered, "Let's go meet the fire." The old white church had never been so full. The air inside was thick, part fear, part curiosity. Every pew was taken, and the cross at the altar seemed to watch silently, judging no one but witnessing everything. Sheriff Lark stood at the front. "Eleanor Grant," he said, "you've been accused of witchcraft, of raising the dead." "We don't wish harm, but the people need answers." Eleanor stepped forward. Her face glowed softly in the lamplight, her hands clasped before her, still scarred and blistered. "I have never raised the dead," she said quietly. "I only prayed for the living." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A farmer shouted, "Then how do you explain the soldiers?" "The boy? The child?" Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "Do you believe I hold power greater than God himself?" Silence. She continued, "I asked for mercy. He gave it. And if he chose to grant it through my voice, then blame not me. Blame your own hearts that have forgotten faith can still move mountains." The words hung heavy. For a moment, even the angry faces softened. But then another man rose, trembling with rage. "You mock us with your riddles. We saw the candlelight burn like lightning. We heard your midnight song, devil's work, plain as day." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though her voice did not waver. "If mercy looks like magic to the faithless, then perhaps your hearts need healing more than your bodies ever did." Samuel could hold his silence no longer. He stepped beside her, his voice trembling but firm. "My wife is no witch. She has given more kindness than this whole town combined. She feeds your hungry, prays for your dying, and comforts your lost. If her prayers heal, then thank heaven, not accuse her. His eyes swept across the crowd, faces of neighbors, people he'd baptized, buried, and married. Have we grown so blind that compassion looks dangerous? He asked. So fearful that we punish the only light left among us? Even Sheriff Lark lowered his gaze. A murmur spread, a flicker of shame passing over the room. But before anyone could speak, the church doors burst open. Cold wind swept in, carrying the smell of pine and rain. A figure limped down the aisle, a man in a tattered blue uniform. His beard was thicker now, his eyes bright with determination. It was the Union soldier. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He raised his hand. "I was dead," he said hoarsely. "Shot through the chest near Chattanooga. The preacher's wife found me. She sang over me. I woke up breathing when I should have been cold in the ground." The crowd buzzed again, some in awe, others in disbelief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, charred piece of paper. "This was my mother's hymn, a prayer our family used to sing. She died when I was young, and I thought the song was lost forever. But when I lay dying, I heard it again, word for word." He turned toward Eleanor, his voice trembling. "How did you know that song?" Eleanor's eyes glistened. "Because your mother was my sister." A hush fell so deep, it seemed even the church walls held their breath. The soldier stepped closer. "My mother's name was Mary Hollis," he whispered. Eleanor nodded. "And mine is Eleanor Hollis Grant. We were separated after our parents died. I never knew where she'd gone, until I saw her prayer in your heart." Tears rolled down the soldier's cheeks. "All these years. I thought I had no family left." "You didn't lose her," Eleanor said softly. "She's been guiding you all along. That night, when I sang, I wasn't calling you back from death. I was answering her call." The church was utterly silent. Even the wind outside seemed to still. And slowly, one by one, the townsfolk began to lower their heads. The fear that had filled the room began to melt, replaced by something deeper, wonder. By the following morning, the story had spread through every corner of Maple Hollow. The same people who'd come with torches now came with tears. Women brought baskets of bread. Children brought wildflowers to the parsonage steps. The sheriff came personally to apologize. "We were blind, Miss Eleanor." "Forgive us." Eleanor smiled gently. "There's nothing to forgive. Fear makes enemies of neighbors, but grace makes family out of strangers." And from that day forward, her midnight hymn became something sacred in the hollow. It was no longer whispered as witchcraft, but sung as prayer. They called it the Resurrection Hymn, not because it raised the dead, but because it brought hearts back to life. Years passed. The war raged on, but the hollow remained a small island of peace. People traveled miles to meet the woman who resurrected her guests, not to witness magic, but to feel her calm, her kindness. Eleanor often said, "I never raised the dead. I only reminded them how to live." Her house became a place of refuge, her voice a balm for those who'd lost everything. When soldiers passed through, both Union and Confederate, she fed them alike. "Pain," she told them, "knows no uniform." The preacher's sermons grew quieter in his old age, but Eleanor's song still filled the hollow, floating through the trees at dusk like a promise. One bitter winter morning, frost clung thick to the parsonage windows. Samuel's cough had grown worse. The doctor from the next town said there was nothing to be done. Eleanor sat by his bedside holding his frail hand, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The fire flickered low. "Eleanor," he whispered weakly, "don't cry for me. You've given life to so many. Let me rest now." She shook her head, tears spilling silently. "I can't let you go." He smiled faintly. "You already have, every time you gave yourself away to help another." That night she sang for him, the hymn she'd sung for so many others. But this time, the candle's flame didn't flare higher. It stayed steady, soft, and warm, as if guarding his spirit on its way home. When dawn came, Samuel was still, peaceful, and Eleanor's heart finally broke. For days, the townsfolk came to comfort her, but Eleanor spoke little. Her once bright eyes seemed to gaze beyond the world. On the seventh night after Samuel's passing, neighbors saw a glow through her window, a single candle burning. They heard a faint voice singing the resurrection hymn one last time. When morning arrived, the candle had melted to its base, and Eleanor was gone. Her chair was empty. Her shawl lay neatly folded. The scent of wildflowers, though it was the dead of winter, lingered in the room. Some said she passed peacefully in her sleep. Others whispered she simply walked out of the world, following the light she had always sung about. Decades later, travelers still came to the ruins of the old parsonage. Children would dare each other to stand there at midnight, claiming to hear a woman's soft voice humming through the wind. But those who came with broken hearts or weary souls often said something stranger. They said the hymn brought warmth to their chests, a comfort they couldn't explain, and they would leave Maple Hollow lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted. To this day, the locals say the preacher's wife still resurrects her guests, not from death, but from despair, because love, once sung, never really dies.